Yeah, you want?
I found it here. Is it yours?
No,
No?
but it's generally for people having headaches. They can come up and get their.
Oh, I thought it was yours. Wow, good idea.
No, actually, I do have it in the bag.
Oh, you do? Actually, no, I'm thinking it's a good idea.
We found it here, if you like.
Oh, why not?
Give it through the rows.
No, I don't want to profess everyone has a headache. But just coming into this working group.
Right. What was the version of the slides you guys pulled down for me? Do you remember?
So
Because I updated them middle of yesterday.
yeah, so I only uploaded them last night.
This is probably okay.
So you are.
If you think the version on the portal is wrong, then let us
Is this
know.
I don't know. How would I know which version?
You wouldn't. It'll be fine. Actually, if you skip down 3 slides, I'll let you know. Keep going, a few more, keep going, until it says number 3.
So we need to start. It's 1 minute
Okay,
over.
no, it is the older version. So I had updated it a lot in the middle of yesterday. Any chance you could pull down the new version? Just a hyperlink.
Does this work? Hello, hello. Can anybody please close the door? We need to start. Can somebody please close the door? Okay, let's start. This is the Netconf working group session. If you think you are wrong, you have still time to change the room. So Mahesh and myself will help you to progress. So before we can start, we have already 2 main note takers, but everybody is asked to help taking notes on the either pad. Are you showing?
No.
Who's showing? Are you going to show the slides? Yeah, then we need to show the slides now, please. So on the Netconf status slides number 2, there is the Etherpad URL. Please, everybody help us to take notes. Mikael Abrahamson is the Jabber taker. So everybody please show your badge to him to write down the name correctly. Yeah. So the not well has to be shown. Can you show slide 3, the not well? Slide 3, please. Okay, so please take note of the slide here. Anything you say in this room is a contribution to IETF. So be careful and take care of IETF processes. Read this slide carefully and also take care of the related RFCs. All IETF contributions are subject to the rules in RFC 5378 and 3979, updated by RFC 4879. So please take care of IETF process and the note well slide here. Should we continue? So the status of chartered working items since Berlin. We had a success with Netconf, and it is now ISG approved and in the hands of editors. RFC editor. Yang patch in ISG evaluation. There will be soon ISG approval. We have a few open issues with Zero Touch. They are all in review state. 50-77 bis has been adopted as working group item, but also Netconf event notification has been adopted, and RESTconf and HTTP transport for event notification have been adopted as working group item. Yeah, let's go shortly through the agenda. We have charted items. First, there is a zero-touch provisioning for Netconf Call Home. Then the server model draft package, which is consisting of the key store model, SSH client server, and TLS client server models, Netconf client server, and RESTconf client server models. So we will go through them. As far as I understand, this will be pretty much easy. We have then the Netconf notifications package, consisting of subscribing to Yang Data Store push, subscribing for event notifications, Netconf support for event notifications, RESTconf, and HTTP transport for event notifications. Netconf access control model is something different. This is not in the notification package. This is pretty much new. It is a chartered topic, so we will discuss how and when to adopt the draft from Andy. So we have two non-chartered items on the agenda. One is the voucher draft from Kent. We will discuss it and decide whether we want to adopt it as working group item. So as far as I understand, other working groups are also interested in this work, but Netconf, yeah, would like to adopt this draft. Okay, data store design team discussion will be the last discussion topic in the session here. We reserved 40-45 minutes for this discussion. I don't know whether we need all the time. Let's see. We can have nice discussions. Also, if any other draft takes longer than planned, yeah, it'll be a bit shorter. But there is still sufficient time. So based on the recently adopted drafts, the milestones in the charter page need to be updated. We prepared a few milestone proposal, discussed them with the draft authors, agreed on a particular milestone list. So we will, I would like to ask you now whether there is a comment on the proposed milestones, or we can go with the prepared milestone list here. So zero-touch configuration would be then going to working group last call in coming January, and the month after it'll be then submitted to ISG. Netconf server configuration data models, this is the package, would be then going to working group last call in March 2017, the month after it'll be submitted to ISG. Young subscription and event notification drafts. This is again plural. The package is meant to be prepared for working group last call by February 2017, and the month after going to ISG. 5277 bis is in parallel to Yang subscription documents. Also in February going to working group last call, and in March to ISG. 6536 bis, because this is a new draft, will be then prepared for working group last call by March 2017. If there is a comment, please speak up now. If there is no objection or comment, we will then execute like this. So the charter page is going to be updated with the milestones listed on slide 9. There is one draft remaining, though, from the current charter, which is the RESTconf collection resource draft. It was unclear when it could be finalized because different things are open. I just would like to know from the main author, Andy, let's have a short discussion what you think we could do and when we could finalize it. As we are updating the charter page for the milestones, we should do it also for this one.
Yeah, I told you it could be like 8 to 12 months, and there doesn't seem to be much agreement between the authors or anything. So we're basically starting from scratch. And
this means 3 months, 4 months, or how many?
Anything.
But saying 12 or more is not good.
well, then we can just drop it.
Drop it for now and adopt later again, or
No, we could just drop it and then
or
forget
we
about it.
we can put it on hold with the permission of the AD.
Well, it requires a lot of complex implementation. So, like, it requires XPath, mandatory.
As it is
implementation of
already
XPath.
chartered and has draft IETF on it, I mean, we probably should keep it as it is and put on hold, right? Benoit, what do you say?
Well, I don't think there's any agreement on it, so I don't have as optimistic a view on when it's going to be completed. You can put it on hold, sure. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, on hold does not mean we have to do it. We can drop it later if you like.
okay.
Okay. So Benoit, I just would like to hear from you whether you are okay with this.
Benoit Claes. So that's a difficult one, right? Because you can put it on hold. What I understood from Andy is that whether we drop it now or later, it will be the same conclusion. It's a voluntary-based organization, right? I cannot impose that we do this work. So what do you want me to answer, right? Until people agree to do something, well, so do whatever you want with the document, right? Maybe just put a status in the mailing list telling this is a status. If someone else wants to work on this, fine. If you find a new editor, if you find like new energy for a document.
So let us have a short discussion then here. Who knows this draft at all, and who would like to continue with this draft in this working group? So I saw from Lada and more explicit questions you like.
No,
All right.
split the questions.
Split the question. So the first question is, who is interested?
Please show hands. I don't like hum actually. Please show hands who knows this draft. Kent and Lada, Andy for sure. And this is it. And are the people in the room or who in the room is interested to continue the work on ResConf collection resource draft? Kent. This is not much.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm reluctant because it is an adopted draft with draft IETF on it. So it's not.
So, I mean, just to advocate this, I think it's ResConf is kind of an incomplete solution without a way to support very large lists, with millions of entries. Typically, there's support for pagination, filtering, sorting, things of this sort. It has to be done sooner or later. As of right now, I know there are many proprietary solutions for doing just this because it has not yet been scoped in the IETF. So to me, it seems like it has to be done sooner. It should be done sooner or later.
So this is also the reason why I'm reluctant to drop it immediately. We should have a discussion on this also on the mail list and try to find people who support and spend effort on it. And maybe we can activate it pretty soon and then it's good.
Andy Bierman again. We have the same problem with Netconf, large lists, and we don't have any solution in Netconf. And it hasn't seemed to be a problem there. So the issue is like how complicated is this thing going to be? You know, sorting, paginating. It's like a top end kind of thing. It may be better left to proprietary work if people want to do a lot of complex things and can't agree on what to do.
Okay.
Maybe the more relevant question to ask is who is interested in actually working on the draft? Any show of hands on people who want to work on the draft?
We asked this already.
We've done a proprietary solution called Get Bulk, which lets you iterate through lists, much like S&P Get Bulk, but it gets list entries at a time, not leafs at a time, with all the bells and whistles from RESTconf, like depth and filtering and stuff like that. That's a simpler solution.
Yeah.
It applies to both Netconf and RESTconf.
Based on the fact that this, Lada, go ahead.
I agree that it would be useful to have some pagination facility, but I don't know. There are services, let's say Google search, that do this on a just standard basis. So maybe this, and so I believe even some RESTful services can be just consulted and their solution reused probably. So I don't know if it really requires some hardware.
Yeah, okay.
Like
Go ahead.
a new draft and so on.
So I think you're saying that we could leverage an existing solution. Indeed, I mean, there is one of the co-authors on the draft has an existing solution that we were hoping to standardize.
So, okay, so at least two people are speaking in favor of it, and so we are not going to decide it here. We will have a discussion on the mail list, raise the question again there, and get comments, and the coaches will, lead it to consensus on the mail list. So I'm not in favor of dropping it immediately because it's a working group item and draft IETF draft. So we should try to enable it again. So let's see.
Benoit Claes. So that's fine. Perfect. Now, Kent, you want to work on this? Very nice. I appreciate, but it's maybe not the top priorities. They are like key store, etc., to be done before, because these are bottlenecks. He's answering exactly.
Okay, so so we can then decide on the appropriate milestone later. The other decision we need to take today is on the voucher draft, but we will discuss it later. Next slide. You can continue with those.
All right, so this is a tool I think Joe Clark put together, and Benoit has been encouraging people to check on the dependency and where the bottlenecks are with respect to any collection of drafts. So the Yang push set of drafts, which actually only had 2 models in them. I was expecting to see more, but I guess, okay. So it's a fairly small set, and right now event notifications is the bottleneck in that, as I read the graph. So, but, take it for what it is. The Netconf RESTconf server dependency is a slightly more interesting. It points to, as Benoit already mentioned, the key store draft as the bottleneck. Almost all the models have some dependency on it. So maybe that, in order of priority, if anything, key store may be the one to go after first. And that's it.
Okay, so let's move on to the first agenda item, zero touch. Kent.
All right, Kent Watson. Update to the zero touch draft since IETF 96. At IETF 96, we reviewed a mildly updated draft and its 7 open issues. I'm happy to report that all those 7 issues are now in the review state, and the fix is in the current draft. These are indeed the update or the issues themselves on the left-hand side. And since we have some time in this presentation, I'll just quickly or slowly, somewhat quickly go through these. First was factoring the ownership voucher and the voucher revocation into separate documents. Again, this will be discussed at the end of this meeting, but one of the open issues was what to do about this. And so the solution was to factor it out. A second is to remove the configuration handling options, edit config, and yank patch, and also remove the default values. So before there was some other config handling options. I think it was, I mean, the remaining ones are merge and replace, right? So we removed edit config and yank patch as options. 13, defined how a Bootstrap server can return signed data. You may have recalled there was a lot of discussion on list about encodings, canonical formats. You know, you talk to one JSON server or a different, you know, different JSON implementations could encode the JSON differently. And yet when you're signing the data and you're verifying the data, it actually has to be exactly the same, including white space. And so how do we handle this? And so we have a proposal for addressing this. 14, added recommendations for removable storage devices to use standard space file systems when possible, exactly what it says. 15, replaced the notification type enumeration, script warning and error. So there were just these 2 notifications, and now there's 4. So there's a pre-script warning error and a post-script warning error, and this is because now there's both pre-scripts and post-scripts. 16, switched the owner certificate to be encoded using a PKCS7 format. And before it was just an X509 certificate, but we realized it really needed to be a bundle of certificates. 17, replaced the MD5 SHA-1 fingerprints with a SHA-256 fingerprint because it's the more modern hashing algorithm, but it's also inside a choice node for future extensibility purposes, right? So it can be later augmented and other fingerprinting formats can be added. Lastly, there were a ton of editorial changes. So if you look at the diff of the draft from previous time, you'll notice it looks like the entire thing changed. But this is because mostly because I went through the entire draft with a very fine tooth comb and tried to make it as perfect as possible. But, you know, little things like typos and commas, you know, it makes the diff look huge. Okay, so open issues. So there are no formal open issues yet. If you look to the GitHub repo, you'll see all the issues there are in the review state. But I was never able to use the OpenSSL command line tool to create just the bag of CRLs. I'll explain that in a second, which might translate to implementation complexity. Okay, so in the draft, there's this concern for if the device is on a private network and it receives a certificate and it wants to verify the revocation status of the certificate. How would it do that if it can't reach out to the internet to get you know, a CRL response or an OCSP response? And so the idea is that the Bootstrap server could also return the CRLs. Remember, it's not just the certificate, but a chain of certificates. So it also has to be a chain of CRLs. And so it's a bag of CRLs. That's what the PKCS7 RFC talks about. Again, the source, the OpenSSL command line tool couldn't do it. You can do it using code, you know, C code, but so I don't know, again, this goes to implementation complexity. And by the way, I think this is my last slide or second to last slide. So if there's any questions on any of these points, please jump to the mic. Okay, next. We should likely use CMS instead of PKCS7. So PKCS7 is actually used for lots of collections. There's bag of CRLs we just talked about, but there's also supporting the bag of certificates. It can also be used for signing. You know, just in fact, when we talk about how do we, one of the open issues, how do we sign data? Well, we're using PKCS7. Well, the thing is, PKCS7 is sort of the outdated RFC. It's been replaced within the IETF with CMS, and they're really the same. So I don't believe there's going to be any details or specific issues. It's just replace probably a string search and replace operation one for the other and update the ROC numbers. But so minor issue, not a big major issue. I just want to bring it to your attention. Next, I wonder if the draft's use of Yang to define an artifact format is okay. This particular issue is discussed in great detail when we look to the voucher draft, so I don't want to really touch on it much right now, but just quickly, Yang is used to define configuration and operational state. The idea being is that you can obtain it through a Netconf server or RESTconf server. But here we're really saying that we wanted to define a file format, right? An artifact, something that we could obtain from a removable storage device. And so how do we do that? I mean, it's easy enough for me to explain how I'm currently planning to do it, but is it good enough from a standard space perspective, right? So this is the topic that we'll touch on when we're going over the voucher draft. A couple people questioned if operators would accept the solution as a whole. I think if you look at it, there's really two different approaches it's taking towards conveying trust. One is using transport level security, which I think is fairly simple for operators to deploy. The second is using artifacts level security or message document signatures, right? Which involves the operators having a private key and needing to maintain a private key and using that private key to sign the data. And so the whole issues around PKI infrastructure is in play. And how complex might that be? From a specification perspective, there's no issue. It's technically correct. It's just a matter of deployability. So I don't know if anyone wanted to discuss this point here.
Ian Farrer. I guess a lot of it comes down to what domain of the network you're talking about it for. As speaking for Deutsche Telekom's perspective, and what we plan to do with it, yes, as an operator, we do want that, but this is more in the home network case. We've done other things in the past for rolling out our 3G RAN backhaul that has ended up with very convoluted and very non-standardized solutions. So if something like this had been about when we were doing that, we needed a solution and we ended up inventing our own with a vendor. So, there's definitely places where it's useful for us.
Okay, thank you.
Bob Moskowitz, Agency Consulting, and a long-time person in the PKIX world. Excuse me. And I'm only going to address this one question on the operator acceptance and so forth. You should look at doing an OpenSSL implementation. I have done signing certificates and CRLs and the rest all in OpenSSL. You should be able to do it and do a hackathon to say, here is the cheap solution which you would never deploy in a production environment, but to show whether this stuff works the way you think it should work. Of course, you say operators, and maybe that's the whole thing. My background is more back in my old days, my young days of the corporate side, and I wonder about whether the enterprises would accept this solution, and that's one of the separate subjects I need to have with you, Kent, because I'm having a lot of trouble just wrapping my mind about how this will work in an enterprise.
Okay, yeah, good point. When I say operators, I do sort of mean operators and enterprises and startups and anybody else who might want to deploy a solution like this. Really, it's to vendors, right, and all their customers. Who all might their customers be that would like to use zero touch? Typically, zero touch is for larger vendors, but if you look at the Animo working group and their bootstrapping strategy with IoT type devices, so more consumer oriented devices, but these aren't those. And with regards to OpenSSL, so I think the suggestion is you would like to see a reference implementation, proof, actually an implementation with OpenSSL that shows this in operation posted to GitHub or something like this.
I would think so. You can do pretty much all of it. When I've worked on so many things, like in mail, if you implement a postfix yourself, you go to the postfix website, where it has all the OpenSSL commands here on how to make certificates for your mail server, as an example. It's like, we know how to do this.
Sure, yeah, and so I think, so the draft itself is posted to the GitHub repo, and in that there's a subdirectory, I forget what it's called right now, but it's not, it doesn't make it sound like what it is, but what it is currently, it is in fact a, it sets up the whole PK infrastructure. There's a root CA, there's an intermediate CA, there's the, the actual owner, and then it does the whole, so it actually steps through all these things, but you're right, and I use it for proofing out some of my ideas, but I never polished it off and meant to be as a deliverable, but it wouldn't be hard for me to do this. So I will do this. Thank you. Okay, so before I leave the open issues slide, there was another issue that was raised with regards to one of the sources of bootstrapping data being the DHCP server. And from Ian Farrow, who's in the room, and maybe I should just let him speak for himself at this moment.
So Ian Farrow, yeah, on reviewing the draft, the DHCP section in there, I think needs a bit of work. So both in terms of how the options are defined and the process that is used for bootstrapping in there. So I'll volunteer to provide you some text for that.
Right. Okay. So thank you for offering to help with writing some text, but to the working group. Currently, all the sources of bootstrapping data are returning exactly the same artifacts. I know there's an issue with regards to the use of that name, but that's what's in the draft right now, so I'll just say it, which is specifically XML or JSON documents for the redirect information or the bootstrap information, which could, especially in the case of the bootstrap information, become a large document because the bootstrap information contains the initial configuration, which is unbounded as to how large it might be. DHCP has significant size challenges, and the ability, technically, to return such a large document in DHCP is frowned on, maybe even impossible.
Well, there is some specific text in, I think it's RC 7227, which it almost describes this case to a T, of saying that if you had bootstrapping information and a lot of configuration that needs to come from there, you may be better to provide a pointer to a configuration server, an HTTP server, or whatever that you could retrieve that from. You've got both DHCP 6 and DHCP 4 in here. Whilst technically I think you could do that with DHCP 6, and just put all of those options into as many fragments as you needed to. You're not going to be able to do that with DHCP 4, so you're going to end up with a more complicated and diverse solution for DHCP 4 versus 6.
Okay, great. So I believe this is now a new open issue that we should resolve, and it will likely have impact to the document. So this particular source of bootstrapping data will no longer be symmetric, right? I mean, architecturally, I was hoping that all sources of bootstrapping data could return exactly the same kinds of data, but in this situation, it will have to be different. So,
yeah, that's what I'm expecting. I'll know more obviously once I've worked through it, but yes, that's the way I'm thinking about it at the moment.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So also there's another source of bootstrapping data, the DNS server, and sort of like with the DHCP server, I'm not myself a DHCP expert, and thankfully Ian was able to review this and catch this. I suspect there might be a similar issue with the DNS, using the DNS server as a bootstrap source. And so I'm hoping that there may be a DNS server expert in the room or online that would be willing to help with this. If not, perhaps we could, with the Opster review, ask for an expert, a DNS expert, to come in and help review that very specific part to make sure we're using DNS server correctly. So Benoit, maybe that's to you, as to the ability to reach out to find someone to help us review the DNS server section. Ops, right, the Opster review. Already, I think you, yes, okay. Take it to them, post it to their mailing list. Okay, Benoit's nodding his head. All right.
What did you say?
The DNS ops.
I didn't see.
DNS ops.
Working.
Can you say it on the microphone, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. So there is like a mailing list, the DNS ops, right? Why don't you just reach to those guys?
Okay, great.
So we will contact DNS ops
Right.
guys.
That's my action item.
You have a few minutes still.
Okay, I just want to make sure I touch on it. Okay, great. So then the last slide here, final stretch. This draft, I believe, is ready for last call. I mean, other than just the few issues we touched on right now, I don't believe, fundamentally they're going to change the solution. They're just more like details. So as I just mentioned, there's already a request for an early Opster directorate review. So, we can run that review in parallel to doing a last call. I had written an email to the list a couple weeks, like when I posted the draft, right, 2 weeks before the meeting when the cutoff was happening, saying I felt this was it, and now's the time for reviews. I was hoping for significant reviews to come in so we could absorb those comments now, address them, and then go into last call. So we can do that process in parallel. Okay, so a question. Has anybody implemented or planned to implement any part of this draft? I'm just trying to get a sense for support. I see. Okay, please come to the mic.
Rick Taylor, sorry, covering my past for anonymity. Yeah, I want to implement this. It's a bit further down my roadmap, so probably not the answer you wanted, but I've been following this.
So what was your name again?
Rick Taylor.
Okay.
Yeah, I like this. We're looking for a more elegant open standard solution to our proprietary one. This seems to fit a lot of our criteria.
Okay. And don't you guys, right? No? Andy, didn't you say that you had some customers that have interest in this?
Yes, there is significant customer interest in call home, zero touch, and I believe also the server models. And so we're looking at implementing and starting in a few months.
Okay, great.
Radek Krejčíc, we are working on it. It's a work in progress. And
okay.
Bob Moskowitz. I'm coming here from DOTS work group, and where there is discussion, meta discussions about whether DOTS is going to invent its own protocols or it's going to be able to use Netconf, ResConf for some things, at least for the bulk data channel. And so since it has requirement for mutual authentication, which means for the most part certificates, does this work? So that's what's brought me to your draft very late in the game. But in DOTS, we have the problem of inter-organizational trust issues because it's a customer of the service who is requesting the certificate from their DOTS mitigator provider, and whether your particular model fits on this or will be just be guidance for what else I may be having to do for that. I've just started reviewing it, but my direction here is really not the within side of the operator side of an enterprise. I have enterprise background, but more can DOTS use this or learn from this?
Okay, so sounds like a sign of support to address that specific thing, what you mentioned. The voucher format, which we'll discuss later at the end of this session, has in it the certificate of the signer, right? Or the, so the manufacturer itself does not have to sign the owner's certificate signing request. They can go to any CA of their choice. They only need to pass that signed certificate back to the manufacturer so that they can include it in the voucher. And so this gives flexibility, agility. It allows the, like if the owner loses their private key or whatever the case might be, they can always go get their CA of choice to reissue a new certificate and then have a new voucher, generated for it.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You can have a more detailed discussion
We'll have
offline.
more detail later, but just that this is what's brought me here.
We would appreciate your detailed discussion offline if you bring it to question or any issues to the mail list. This is also wonderful. But we would like to hear, as Kent is asking for last call, we would like to hear whether anybody sees an open issue we need to address before last call. If not, last call can be started pretty soon.
Actually,
I'd
that was
like
a
to
question I
update-
was going to ask.
I'd like
Kent.
to update the draft first,
Right.
based
Yeah,
on the
sure.
issues that we just
But
talked about.
I would like to hear whether anybody sees any issue which is open, or as you also have written, Kent, lingering questions or concerns. So I don't hear anything. This is, in my opinion, support for last call in principle, yes. So go ahead, Kent, and update the draft, and then we will go to last call. So this is the agreement I see here.
Okay, great, thank you.
So next is still yours,
Next is
I think.
yours.
Server model.
All right, next presentation, the server model package, which actually is a misnomer, right? It's no longer just server. It's now client and server. And furthermore, it's not just client and server, there's also a key store. But that makes for a bad title or a bad package name at least. But as mentioned, there are in fact there's 5 different drafts involved, and the last 4 drafts actually contain 2 separate Yang modules in them. So a total of 9 Yang modules. Recap, at IETF 96 in Berlin, we reviewed the final server model draft split decision, and we went over some open issues. Update since, there's actually been very little progress due to my focus on many other drafts. I was involved in 3 separate design teams, and there's a lot of push for op state and focus on that. So this particular package of drafts didn't get much update. Indeed, only 3 issues were resolved. First being is the system keychain draft was renamed to key store. I think everyone saw the messages about that. Next was the selection of PKCS7 to store certificate chains. That was also on the list. And also, we selected the strategy for storing passwords. It was actually discussed in last time's meeting, and so that's been incorporated. So all the drafts were updated, but primarily only to address the key store renaming issue, right? So a very minor update, hence why a very minor presentation. Next up, now that the zero touch draft and also the voucher drafts are winding down, this package drafts will get my focus again. As it's been pointed out, the key store draft is the highest dependency, so the key store draft will be the first that will get the focus. Also, we'll focus on the Netconf call home reference implementation. This is something I've been working on a hackathon for a couple hackathons now, but the reference implementation uses the server model configuration data models, so it's an implementation of this draft, and I think it's important to have implementations and running code. So I'll also be trying to update the reference implementation so we have a proof of this working. This is the last slide, so any questions or comments here? Okay.
Your implementation, are you going to provide it somehow to working group members?
It's posted on GitHub already, and
Okay.
in previous presentations there was a URL for it.
So
posted.
it will be available as reference implementation?
It is, yes.
Okay, thanks. Wonderful.
Right.
Thanks. So let's continue with design team.
Design? No, it's not.
No, this is the design with Z.
Just a quick question, Benoit, Claire speaking. So this set of draft in the package there, I don't recall, they've been to last call already, or they're waiting for the key store to go all to last call together?
I think they are waiting on keys.
So no, they're not ready yet. In fact, if you remember, we just created the client models very recently, and only the SSH client model was created. The RESTconf and TLS client models are completely missing. They're not even defined yet.
Okay, good.
And so it's good. We're not close.
It would be better to bring them together into last call so they are similar and depending on each other. So Eric, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Voigt. I'm going to be reporting out on behalf of the design team, which you enhanced a second ago.
Yeah, let us explain and clarify the background. I mean, this is a team of people volunteering to discuss in virtual meetings to have progress, and they indeed had substantial progress, which is very much appreciated. But as a matter of fact, it is not a design team in IETF terms. Design team in IETF terms is usually a close group of people. They are nominated by the AD or chairs. This volunteer team is open to everybody, and they are meeting and reporting to the mail list, which is very important, and they are asking on the mail list for comments on their discussion result. Any agreement in this team is actually the agreement of the team and not the agreement of the working group. And they are repeatedly providing their discussion result to the mail list and asking for comments. So as Mahesh was saying, discussion on the mail list is kind of missing right now because all of the interested people are already in the team. So we will raise discussion on the mail list just to ensure the whole working group is discussing and agreeing. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
So we've met 14 times since the last IETF. All the meeting minutes, all the recordings, everything is up in public. All you got to do is go to our GitHub site, and it's linked at the end of here if you want to see any of the deliberations or discussions. And as Mehmet mentioned, it's all preliminary. It's up to this team here to go ahead and say we are making the right decisions in the sub-team. So everything that I'm going to be talking out now and all the preliminary stuff that we think is there still goes through the traditional review process that we have in this team. So what I'm going to do is review what we have. We have 4 drafts, 3 of which were adopted since the last go-around in Berlin. And we have authors and participants. And again, thanks for all the meetings from the people who are on the left side of the list. We really do have a pretty good running set of people working here. Now,
So just one point. Again, I mean, if anybody wants to involve, just approach Eric.
yeah, anybody is welcome to come. I mean, we're open. All right, so I have just 2 real quick slides to set up the context that was there since last IETF. I mean, this is pretty much the same context with the last IETF. Basically, the idea is we want to allow subscriptions to either events or Yang data stores. And the subscriptions to the Yang data stores are going to be to Yang models, which are IETF based or any other model group that is creating the model. So we want a organization independent mechanism of subscription to the Yang models. And we want to allow a streaming mechanism, which is transport agnostic, allowing multiple transports coming out. So that's really the overall context. We talked about it plenty last time. There are 4 drafts. The 4 drafts are broken into 2, which are subscription mechanism. One is a base subscription mechanism, which replaces 5277 with 5277 biz. And that's just to be able to subscribe to an existing stream of messages. The second draft, or the Yang push draft, it builds upon it by letting you identify specific subtrees and applying specific Yang object filters to the subscription to provide enhanced filtering capability. The other 2 drafts at the bottom are doing it over Netconf transport, and the other one doing it over RESTconf and HTTP2 transport. We split them out because we want to have this mechanism be supportable over other transports as well. Now, the color coding is there really to help you get a context in this last context slide. What you see here, again, is another view of things. The subscription management is on the left, showing that we have basic capabilities for subscriptions, for configured subscriptions, static, people call it, for dynamic subscriptions, stream discovery. On the bottom, you can see what we'll be talking about later today in the op state. Oh, these are the old slides. So this is a previous version of the op state draft to say what are we going to need in the future to take into our filters. As I'll mention in a bit, we don't want to have op state coverage in this particular set of drafts, but we want to make sure it can be extended to allow that type of filter to be used. We have encoding in Yang and the transport over different types of transport protocols. Now, I'm going to go through the drafts one by one to talk about what the changes are and what the open issues are. There's a few interesting questions which you're going to hear about that we're, as a team, bringing up and saying, these are what we're thinking about. Do you guys have any input at this time as we work through the drafts? So we're going to talk about what's going on since IETF 96 and Yang push. We have a new rev. We have a updates not sent flag. What does that mean? It's possible that if you're doing a push, that perhaps you have not been able to aggregate all the information that you'd want into the push. And so there's a flag there that says, oh, by the way, this is an incomplete update, and you can decide on your side what to do if you think the update is incomplete. There's a not notifiable extension, and that is like you have a counter that you want to subscribe to. It says, make sure this field doesn't get pushed in on-change updates. That can be done and applied via extension against an object in a data store, and that lets people not have to do a complex filter to filter out those things which should be non-notifiable. We've moved our start and stop information into the base subscription draft, and we've created an anchor time which lets you set the time period for a subscription. We made sure and defined that the dampening period for how often do you send updates is for the entire subscription and the whole set of objects. You don't have a dampening period for each of the individual objects in the subscription. In other words, if your interface is going up and down and you have 3 interfaces that you're tracking, you're only going to send an update for all 3 interfaces if they're flapping once every dampening period. You're not going to dampen each individual interface. And that has certain behaviors there. We have the ability to do an on-change push of all the objects. Let's say you have on-change going on and you've just flipped the whole data store. You can do a full push of the items instead of having to send just a really large set of patches. And there's all other kind of updates there. So what I want to talk about is some, go back.
That's right, Jason Stern. For the dampening, I think there might still be some inconsistencies in the latest draft around that may need to be cleaned up. So I had a question about it. I think there's still a few references to per object dampening in the draft.
All right, if you could point them out to me, that'd be great.
I'll send an email.
Thanks. Or send them to the big list. I'd love to reply. But yes, it should be not per object anymore. So feedback. One of the things that we've been talking about as a design team is simplifying the way we do filtering. And one of the things that was in the initial base Netconf notifications draft was something called a stream. As a team, we said, we really don't want to force streams to be mandatory because not everybody wants to have streams. People want to jump past streams to other types of filters. So we've turned streams, at least in the current draft, into optional, assuming that at some point we're going to have op state out there and we're going to want to have metadata filters on op state to be able to do refinements and creation of our own streams explicitly rather than having something under the covers defining what types of information should be extracted from the filter. Now, how is this tied to op state? Well, op state is effectively, a pre-filter for some of the information on a box. If we're able to use the op state to define what the universe of Yang objects are, we can actually pre-filter things to a certain context. This will accomplish a lot of what we do with stream, but in order to simplify the draft, we're trying to say make streams optional. If you're a vendor or a customer and you want to create your own stream, you can still do that, but it's optional. So I'm trying to see if anybody has any strong opinions on whether streams should stay. If Alex was in the room right now, he's actually traveling right now, or he'd be here, he'd say keep streams in. I think majority of people are saying keep streams optional. Are there any thoughts or opinions in the room for optional or mandatory streams? All right, I'm assuming that optional will stay because I think the design team has been staying there. One other thing, I'm going to jump and hit a slide that's 2 from now because this is an earlier version of the deck. There's also a question on op state with filtering. We do believe that there are issues with metadata filtering with Yang. Basically, our subtree filters and our XPath filters might not give us everything we want with AND type filtering, where I want this type of filter and this type of filter. we have not quite articulated it well enough to assert that we need a new filtering draft across not just subscriptions, but all of Yang get operations. So expect a push at some point from us to do more on filtering, but see it as independent and decoupled from the Yang subscription drafts, because you certainly need filters for a lot more than Yang subscriptions. All right, the next slide, Andy, your updated slide for topic filtering didn't make it here. It'll be in the minutes, but you wanted to talk to topic filtering requests?
Okay, Andy Barron, one of the issues that came up on the design team was doing filtering based on topics. And the pub sub model is normally thought of as topics. What we really have is content filtering, which means you have to filter for the exact data structures that are going to be included in the filter. So the idea is that Yang identities can be used to form a hierarchy of topics. And I think in the examples shown there, so you can create a base of topic type and services, routing, BGP. So at any point, the topic tree can be extended, and when you set your filter for a particular topic, it means that you want the data to be included if the identity is derived from the base that you're filtering on. The advantage of this approach is it allows clients to filter based on some common set of properties rather than everything being model specific. The downside is that it requires that things be mapped to a topic hierarchy, and it requires a topic hierarchy to be created. So I didn't really push a draft out this time because I wanted to see where we are with model classification, and and that kind of falls into the topic tree. I think it would be bad if there were 15 different topic hierarchies instead of one standard one, and that would actually be worse than just content filtering. The advantage is if I just want to filter on routing, for instance, I could have a lot of vendor-specific topics on top of that, and still catch all those kind of topics just by selecting the generic topic. So it's not really explained well in this slide. I think my updated Yang model had a little more into it. But so the question on the table is there interest in this sort of approach, which is like one layer of indirection? It kind of requires that there be interest in creating a topic tree. Now, this is different than the model tree that had been discussed, where we're placing each actual Yang node in its one and only place in the model classification. Things can be classified multiple times, so things, a given subtree can match multiple topics, for example.
And remember, this is independent of subscription. There's reason to do get on topics independently. A lot of the work we're talking about is the complexities of filters. As we go through these things, simplifying filtering is going to be huge, and this gives us another dimension that might be worth working.
Yeah, so the mechanism for deciding the thing as part of the collection is just the derived from or self function that's already defined in Yang 1.1.
Does anybody have opinion on this?
Kent Watson. So if I understand this correct, the idea is that the Yang data model would have annotations in them as to which topic identity would they relate to, right?
Yes, one part of this missing is a Yang extension to map subtrees to topics. There's one way to do that.
And okay, so we have with Yang push the notion of like on change events, right? So then now you're saying that the change event would be related to this topic.
It would be a filter that says, the filter is relevant either way. You can get on a filter if you wanted, but if you wanted to, you can say part of my filter that I'm using for my Yang push is this existing topic. So get with, or push, the idea of having a filter to reduce what you're having come back would benefit from a topic if it's populated.
Okay, so I guess I can see how you could have something like a routing event, right? There could be a subtree that relates to routing. So any value that changes in that subtree is a routing event topic. I can get that. I don't really understand the severity, critical severity. That's not.
Yeah, that's actually that's been dropped. That you should have ignored that. That's
Yeah, we have. There's a new model that you put in. This is not the latest slide.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Rick Taylor, I understand what you're doing here, which is you're adding metadata labels to do filtering. I have a concern that that's adding load onto the actual configuration service that's having to do this, because now, obviously I'm structuring pretty close to the Yang data model, leafs, names, they're all fine. I get that. But now I have to start maintaining all this metadata load as well. And once you introduce one sort of alternate set of metadata, someone might come along and say, oh, well, let's add some other topic hierarchy that we can use for filtering, particularly if filtering leaves just subscriptions and becomes a more general netmod concept and takes off, then I'm worried that us implementers are starting to wonder whether this is a good idea anymore.
Yes.
Andy Marin, yes. The downside is that a topic hierarchy has to be maintained. When the content filtering falls out for free because you have to declare Yang. When you declare an Yang node, its path to root is set in stone.
Right. So I think we've hit this question. The topic, so to speak, is out there. And if people want it, we can push it. It's not a rush. Again, it would become a future filter type. This would not be current work. It would be future work applicable beyond Yang push.
Eric, before you continue, I assume you are doing kind of time management. You have, for the whole package, something like 30, 35 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to jump past this. One more issue that we're asking for feedback on. Some question about making sure that we understand when we've lost or dropped an update more than just using TCP is something we've been talking about. Why would we want this? There are cases where you might have lost a change to an on-change push, and do you want to know about it, or do you want the application to recover? So the idea of potentially having an update number so that when you send your update for a change, you send the current update number and the previous one. If you are missing one or the numbers don't align, you know that you're out of sync and you can do something about it. Could be optional, but it's a way of kind of tracking independent of the transport, whether you've gotten all your updates in order. Because for time's sake, is there anybody who has a strong opinion of whether they want to have a sequence number to make sure that more types of losses and duplications are covered?
Rob Wilson, Cisco, I think it's probably generally a good idea to have this.
Yeah. All right, moving on. Next steps, should we include the push update number? We have one person says could be good idea. We have an option. We'll come back on that. We still have 2 open issues on partial push of periodic updates and potentially adding statistics. At this point, those are open. And then we have to document some stuff that is going to be outside the scope. Again, we're trying to really identify future work here. So that's Yang push. Second one is 5277 biz. We have 2 revs of that. We've gone ahead and simplified a few things, such as removing the receivers of a few messages, a few notifications have been pulled out. We have new groupings for subscription to reduce the number of things that can be modified. We wanted to change the ability to modify things. You can't modify things in a subscription, which would never be modified. We collapsed the models into one large subscription model. We think we're going to have to break it out for backwards compatibility and move some of the information down into the Netconf draft. So where we had 2 models, we think we're going to have a third in order to ensure that we use the same exact namespace that we did with 5277 so the people's implementations don't break, which is a plus. And then there were some other wording, other terminology. I don't think there's too much controversial here. Really, one of the big things we got to do is work on the error codes, scrub for completeness. But I think the state machine and the messages have been solidifying. There are some other issues to work through, but you know, they're less major than a lot of the ones we've worked over the last couple months. RESTconf and HTTP2. In HTTP, we have another revision. We simplified things by making it so that each subscription will go to its own HTTP2 stream if you're using HTTP2. We updated the call flows extensively. There's some nice additions there where you go ahead and send the information on its own stream. If you lose a stream, or if a stream doesn't appear, it will pull down the HTTP session. So it works really well with configured subscriptions. So you actually have to restart the subscription if somebody doesn't recognize what's going on the far end. We have built-in DDoS protection with this because you have to get an ACK to your subscription started message for configured subscription before you start sending people updates. So there's a whole bunch of things that are well aligned with HTTP2. We also do have it working with HTTP 1.1. Whether we want to support that is something that we have to discuss, considering the benefits with HTTP2. There's a lot of cleanup of wording. There is, oh, going back, yeah.
So Rob Wilson, Cisco. So I was reading the draft seeing it supports HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2. I wonder whether it would be a good idea to say make supporting HTTP 2 mandatory and HTTP 1.1 optional in terms of drafts to improve interoperability and reduce the load on the clients effectively.
I certainly have no problem with that. I know, Andy, you might have an opinion because RESTconf kind of looks more to 1.1 than 2. So if we did make 2 mandatory and RESTconf makes 1.1 mandatory, it would work for configured. You might get some savings there, but you'll just run into that potential race condition.
Yeah, I'm just looking to the future.
Yep. So one issue that we're looking for update on, do you want me to jump back? All right. One issue that we did with this message set and the design of the protocol is in past meetings we've talked about the need to align to gRPC and the desire to make sure that there's inline compatibility with our HTTP2 and the gRPC messages that are going across. We ensured that what we used was the post messages that are used by gRPC. So we used the subset, or we tried to use the way that gRPC sends messages to make sure that we were compatible with the push using this method. Now, what does that mean? That means that we will hopefully get direct compatibility with implementations which happen to use gRPC. We believe that's the case, but I don't think we have the expertise to validate that. And we're hoping to find somebody, or maybe even Benoit, if you know somebody in the IETF who might be able to say, yes, this would be working with gRPC. I think that would be a very cool thing to do to try to align some of our protocols with other people. And we're trying to solicit support there. And I don't know if that's going to you or somebody else, but that would be a big win if we could guarantee some integration or compatibility there. So an AI, I guess, since Benoit is nodding his head, is to find somebody that we can verify that this is a match with.
Benoit Claes, I'm sending the email now. There is someone who knows gRPC pretty well here in this IETF.
Excellent. And that'd be pretty cool if we could make this compatible. All right, next steps. We need to fix and verify the gRPC stuff. We have an open question on do we support proxy subscriptions or third-party subscriptions. There's a long discussion. I don't want to get into there, but there are some benefits, but it likely will be a future at this point. Okay, last one. This is the old version, so we don't have the notes from Alberto. Basically, what's going on since IETF 96, we've gone ahead and put in the update for Netconf push. Sorry, for the Netconf transport, the basic things that have happened with the Netconf transport that we still have to work The biggest one is a call home issue. One of the discussions we had with Kent in the discussion calls was, how do we do call home when we want to trigger a configured subscription from a publisher? Because the Netconf has to start remotely, you've got to tell it to go ahead and make a call in order to send the information back over Netconf. And we had some discussions, should this be generic? Should we have an address that we believe that we should be able to send a call home to, so that it goes ahead and establishes a session to us? At this point, we believe that the proper approach for configured subscription is to tell the other side to call home in order to set up the Netconf session properly. That's one issue. The other issue is we're going to be bringing in some additional stuff for dealing with the legacy create subscription from 5277. Those are the two big issues. Other than that, I think most of them have been completed. So if I'm going to go to my last open issue and feedback request, again, the request was, do you guys have a strong opinion on Netconf call home? So far, the team has been recommending that we go ahead and call to a well-known port for Netconf in order to start the session back towards the publisher. Ken, anything you want to add on that? Nope. All right. Anybody have any strong feelings? Does that make sense to you guys? All right, so we'll keep on going. So next steps, that was the question. We have pending other stuff. We have some other filters that we have to define, but we've made a lot of progress on the drafts. So as Mehmet said before, feel free to join in. There have been a lot of discussions and a lot of interactions on these topics so far. And all the results are in the drafts that you're seeing now, but all how did we get there is not exposed. So if you want to see all the details, feel free to come in. And hopefully I hit your time frame. That's pretty much it for this. Any other questions? All right,
just to mention one point, I mean, we are, presenting here issues if nobody provides comments, the draft authors prepare a solution proposal and provide it again to the mail list. If again nobody comments, this solution proposal is, prepared and in the draft, and it is then adopted as a solution. And the draft is still open for review, but please, everybody, provide your comments, your opinion on the solution proposal, which is prepared by the draft authors. And as a matter of fact, if there is nobody commenting or objecting, this will be then the way we are going.
Yeah, Andy Berman, just to comment on that. If the design team didn't exist and you didn't even know about it, there'd still be drafts to review. And that process hasn't changed in 30 years.
No,
so,
this does not change.
So just review the drafts, please.
Yeah, this does not change. I mean, again, if in a meeting we agree on a solution, this is still open for comments on the mail list. It has to be validated on the mail list. So everybody is asked to comment on this, but if there is no comment on the mail list, then this is the way to go.
Yeah. One other note, there are a couple implementations on GitHub for the client. If you guys want a pointer to some code on this, just ping us.
Jason Stern, sorry, one more question in the drafts. There was another thing that wasn't super clear to me, and that is access control interaction with the subscriptions. So there's some comments in there that when you're providing data back, you should just filter out stuff you don't have access to.
Yes.
There's some parts of the draft that say you should refuse a subscription if you don't have access to the nodes being subscribed to.
Yes.
So I wasn't sure which. Those
Yes.
seem to contradict each other a bit. Maybe I'm
Actually,
misunderstanding something.
maybe the wording could be better, but basically you refuse a subscription if you don't have access to the roots nodes that you're trying to subscribe to. So if your targets is not allowed to be subscribed to, it should be refused. If you have access to those, then you'll filter out anything below there that you don't have access to. So
Okay.
that's the goal.
Yeah, okay. It might be good to maybe give
Probably
a
could
couple
make the wording
examples
better.
in the draft for that of what would be accepted and what would be returned in some of those cases.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right, thanks.
thank you. So after having free 20 minutes, you have much more time.
Hi, oops. Okay, I'm going to discuss the, get the clicker. The access control model, which is 6536, and we've updated it. It hasn't been updated in several years, and so we'll go over why we're updating it and what we've proposed so far. So we don't have support in NACM for Yang 1.1. Actions and nested notifications are new, and they weren't covered, so they weren't covered in the original one. Also, NACM doesn't exactly support RESTconf. It talks about Netconf operations only. So we're supposedly, we're going to solve that problem. The working group charter already has support listed in it for dealing with actions. So this is already chartered work in a sense. So the solution overview is to support actions. Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, hi, Dan Bogdanovic. Just a quick question. So for the schema mount, we will also need one of the ideas that we want for schema mount to use NACM. And the question is also, would be then able to use NACM in this case in the updated 14 when we're using the schema mount to create more complicated models?
Well, then, yeah, all right. We'll see if we need any edits here. I'm hoping you can keep that complexity in schema mount. Well, we'll see. So the solutions that we came up with and are in the draft are fairly simple additions. In order to support Yang actions, and this was one of the motivations for adding actions in the first place, is that you can control access control for who can invoke the action based on the subtree it's in. So the user needs to have read access to the ancestor nodes of the action, and they need to have exec privilege for the action itself. And for nested notifications, they need to have read access to the ancestors and read access to the notification itself. And that lets you set an access control rule for a particular interface, and then like the reset action within the interface is only accessible to those people that can read that interface. And so that's the main difference with nested notifications and actions in the draft. Like RPCs are top level, so there's no additional filtering or access checking for that. But it's the same otherwise. And then we also added a section to map RESTconf into the access control model. And so we mapped the method and resource class to the RPC and edit operation. And you can see here my screenshot I captured from the draft. I just stuffed it in there. I didn't want to reproduce the table, sorry. So essentially, the rest of the draft does not need to change because we are mapping the specific RESTconf operations into edit, config, or get, that sort of thing. And then the rest of the draft already talks about those operations. And we also, another issue was that we updated the node instance identifier so it supports actions and notifications. Okay, this means that you use a data rule to select instance of a specific action or notification. And the two sub-bullets are showing that I can select all, foo bar reset or foo baz reset, but I cannot do a one rule that selects all actions named reset. And I can also use the schema node identifier to select specific instances of the reset or just all instances of the reset. So that was a minor addition to the node instance identifier. Let's us do that. And the next steps is to determine we solved all the problems we need to solve for the next version of NACM. and did we do it correctly? And if so, I think we're ready for a working group last call. There's two issues though that have come up: how it relates, how schema mount relates. So what you're talking about, Dan, is that in individual root jail routes, or what do you call them, Lada? So in an individual mount point, you want to use that mount point as the root to apply NACM. So there need to be some way to make sure that's done the same on all implementations. And the other issue that might come up is I2RS.
Yeah. So there are two use cases. One of them when you want to allow to see through the whole tree that was dynamically built, and then in another case is that you will have black boxes, but essentially you have like the parent, you have the child, parent cannot see into the child, and child cannot see into the parent.
Oh, okay. That's like an edge router. The guy owns his own subtree, and
yep.
Okay.
Martin Björklund made the comment that this draft needs to be adopted by the working group first.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes, working group last call.
We also
no,
would
update the draft, adopt the draft. I'm so sorry I left that.
We also would like to see what the focus will be as a whole. I mean, whether we are going to add more things, or I mean, I personally, as co-chair, would be interested to know whether schema mount is going to be supported. And you mentioned something with I2RS, so we would like to understand those issues before adopting.
Yeah, so some of the issues with I2RS were, well, the ones I remember were that we're going to use NACM to assign priorities to clients, which by assigning a priority to a group, you end up assigning a priority to clients. And the other was whether there'd be separate access control for like the dynamic or ephemeral data store versus other data stores.
We tried to implement an ACM for RESTconf using the old specification, and one issue that we ran into was that it wasn't clear in RFC 5267 or what it is, whether these properties are inherited between a parent and child. And we had some discussion about that. I haven't checked the new draft. So is this? So it means that, for example, if I have read access to the child, do I need read access to all its ancestors in order to be able to read this particular? Because in RESTconf it's important.
Okay, so
in RESTconf I
that's
can
a good
just
question.
go to the specific target node, right? So
yeah, so what Lada is saying, and I'm not even, I'd have to check our own code to see what we did, but in Netconf you can only request nodes from the root down. So in my subtree filter, I can say select interfaces, interface. I need read access to interfaces and interface. In RESTconf, I could set the target URL to interfaces, interface, and then the read is starting from the second layer down. So Lada's asking, do I need read access to interfaces as well? And I think the answer is yes, but we should need to make that clear.
Yeah. So in any case, it would be good to clarify this so that it's completely clear how this works.
Okay. I don't have a notepad. Can you capture that in the minutes, please? So yes, bullet 3 there, update the draft, meaning make it a working group draft and then get agreement and start a working group last call.
Lada, can you write it down to the Etherpad? Thanks.
So that's all the slides I had. Any more questions? I'll talk to Sue later about, she mentioned NACM in the new draft, but I looked and I did not see any specifics there. So we'll see what needs to be done.
Right. So this.
Okay.
Yeah, this is actually necessary to do before adopting. I mean, we need to have a clear definition, maybe an initial section for the schema mount issue, or addressing the schema mount and addressing the I2RS, you mentioned already two different requirements.
Yeah.
If we can have an initial section on those topics in a draft update, this will be then asked for adoption. Right. We can do it on the mail list.
Okay, the client ID or priority issue does ripple through to local config for I2RS when it comes to deciding who wins running config or ephemeral config. So I think it's important to work it out for I2RS.
Okay, so let's do so.
So Andy, before you walk away, so one of the issues that I think I've discussed with Andy privately is that NACM has tried to solve the issue of the first two A's in AAA, which is authentication and authorization. There is a piece which is the accounting, which is kind of the draft is silent about. And one of the issues that we are having with customers as we are deploying this NACM solution is they're asking for what is the format of the accounting records? Is there a standard defined for it? And they would ideally, I think every customer would want to know what the format of that record is going to be. Is there interest in this working group? And this is the question is there interest in this working group to try to formalize on what the accounting record is going to look like? Because I think we probably would want to standardize on it. Otherwise, it's every implementation trying to figure out what do they need to send to the AAA server as part of the accounting.
So this question was with co-chair's head.
No,
is there an interest in the working group to address the issue Mahesh described, defining the format of such accounting records? Please show hand. So if you, at least, not many, but
so there is some interest. I want to say.
I can tell we have a proprietary format and also hooks, so vendors can set yet even more proprietary formats.
Ashish from Sienna. If we don't define it, JITEC eventually will, and then we'll have to follow whatever gets defined there. So I recommend we do it in IETF.
So for all of these topics which are not yet in the draft, we would like to have an initial section to see where it is going. So this will simplify the adoption, I assume.
Yeah, I know that there are some audit requirements in I2RS too that were sort of mandatory to implement for I2RS.
Okay, thanks. What's next? Voucher. Next is voucher, I think.
All right. Kent Watson, Juniper Networks.
Hold on.
Sorry.
So Martin and Jürgen, let's see here. This was 1 minute ago. NACM does authorization only. Jürgen said, okay, accounting does not belong into NACM. Someone needs to write a separate ID. And Martin said again, then authentication is done elsewhere. Accounting should not be done in NACM.
Okay. So there were 7 or 8 people showing hands to address this topic in the working group. Martin Björklund is against. So we will discuss it.
Can you speak into the mic?
Yeah. Dan Bogdanovich, there's difference between access rights and then the access and authorization. And then if you really want to do that, I think...
So they clarified. They wanted in a different draft.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. because it's in NACM, it's one thing, and access and authentication authorization is then the other thing, and then you can add to data accounting.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So as I was mentioning earlier in the zero touch draft, the voucher and revocation formats were, it was decided that they should be standardized. And so now I'm going to present a draft that attempts to define a standard format for these artifacts. And the ultimate discussion will be whether or not this working group should adopt this draft. Okay, so first, the two artifacts, right? There's the voucher, which itself is used to assign a device to an owner, right? So an SP buys a device and they wish to, or have, like for instance, in the worst case scenario or in an extreme scenario, have the vendor drop ship the device to a destination, which might be a retail outlet store of some sort. And that device is going to be, the access gateway for that retail outlet store. But how does it know whose its owner is, right? That it belongs to, some specific chain. And so that's what the voucher is for. It's used to assign that ownership to the device. So now the device knows, I am in fact belonging to such an organization. The revocation format, revocation is used to affirm or maybe reaffirm that the assertions assumed when the voucher was signed are still valid at the time the voucher is being processed. So at the time that the device is purchased, right, it may be actually put into a warehouse and sit on a shelf for years, and later on it's pulled out and bootstrapped. At the time that it was purchased, a voucher was generated for it, but since that time, maybe there was an intermediate certificate authority that got revoked. And so now it's unclear if this device, that voucher is still valid, hence the need for revocations. So this draft defines just the artifacts themselves, leaving their distribution to bootstrapping protocols, right? So if this looks a little bit familiar, it is modeled a bit after X509 certificates and the revocation mechanisms around certificates, for which there are two, CRLs and OCSP, right? And both are, or especially OCSP, is somewhat of a protocol of sorts. And so this draft is actually not defining the distribution mechanism, just the artifacts. With regards, okay, maybe it's on the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of history here. The zero touch draft previously stated that the voucher and voucher revocation artifacts would be vendor-specific binary formats. And then in the appendix, it gave an example of what it might look like. However, standardizing this is important because it enables use by multiple bootstrapping protocols for which there is zero touch, and also the Anima Brewski bootstrapping protocol wants to use this voucher. Already the working group has, they're going to use this. And lastly, there's Sixtish Join, another bootstrapping protocol that also wants to use this voucher format. So there's actually a number of bootstrapping protocols that are interested in this concept, and having it standardized in one place so it can be used by many is, of course, exactly what we should do. Question? Okay. Secondly, it enables the development toolchains to decode and, well, encoded them as well, but the encoding actually occurs by the manufacturer. So it's really about decoding them. Truly before, the reason why it was a vendor-specific format, because the only decoder had to be the device itself, right? Only the device needed to decode it. So vendors could create their own proprietary format, didn't matter. It'd just be an opaque blob that that would have to be passed around. But of course, if it's truly opaque, it's not nice because it doesn't allow tools to sort of analyze them and like figure out what their bits and parts are, and so that's exactly the motivation. Okay, so a little bit about the voucher. This, of course, is the tree diagram for it. And you can see that it starts off with an assertion, which is an enumerated field and values like logged and verified. What this means is when this voucher is being issued, to, under what context was it issued? Did the manufacturer actually verify the ownership? Do they have integration into their channel and partner sales channels to verify that ownership? Or is it really just that the manufacturer made a log of the event that this device is being owned by such and such, so that in some future time, if someone else claims that same ownership, then they can detect the collision and generate a report out of it. So that's what these enumerated values refer to. The trusted CA certificate, and I think Bob Moskowitz has left the room, but this is what I was talking about before. This is the certificate for the associated private key that would then be subsequently signing the data that the device is trying to trust. So this is what the zero touch draft refers to as the ownership of the owner certificate. And what the Anima Brisky draft refers to as the domain certificate. Oh yeah, and on the previous point, the assertion enumeration, so it's Anima who uses the logged format, and mostly the zero touch who uses the verified format, but actually it's possible for both protocols to use the other assertion type as well. Okay, so next is the certificate ID, which is more for the zero touch draft. The Anima doesn't use this field itself, but the intent is that so there's the trust anchor for the certificate, but then exactly which certificate is it, right? So we want to know it's this specific serial number or subject name content, and so here we're able to do a match effectively. So the voucher is saying that it applies to a specific serial number. The unique ID, it also, so there can be a list of them. In Anima, there's just a single unique identifier. It can only apply to a single device at a time because the Anima bootstrapping protocol is ephemeral, real-time. It does not have a notion of like long-lived vouchers. But in zero touch, we have long-lived vouchers. So, and the voucher, a single voucher could apply to many devices, and that's why there's potentially a list of them. The nonce is used by the Anima, not used by zero touch at all. And even within Anima, there's an option to use a nonce or not a nonce. When using a nonce, they refer to it as an audit token. When they're using a nonce, when they're using a nonce, it's an audit token. When they're not using a nonce, it's an ownership voucher. The created on field is really just for debugging purposes, right? I mean, it's nice to be able to see when the voucher was generated. The expires on field, of course, is exactly what you think. Just like certificates can expire, so could a voucher be, at the time it's generated. There could be a notion of when it expires. A bit concerning here, the draft goes into details, but when you get into expirations, it relates to time and clocks and the ability for devices to have secure clocks or valid timestamps. So, anybody who really wants to use this field is advised that they have a real-time clock of sorts on their devices. There could be a revocation location as well. So if anyone's familiar with X59 certificates, there's the CDP, the CRL distribution point, which is like a URL. Where could one go to dynamically download the revocation file for the voucher? So for the certificate. So similarly, we can do the same thing for vouchers. And then there's a catch-all AnyData, which, I mean, it's unclear if it's for a place where vendors could stick proprietary extra information. Okay, the revocation file or artifact. There's a revocation type, and there's two types: issuer-wide and voucher-specific, which map, like issuer type is like a CRL. So the issuer is there's a single file that says, hey, here are all the devices that I've revoked. That would be the blacklist. Or here are all the devices that are acceptable to me, the whitelist. Or voucher specific, which is like OCSP, which is saying for a very specific voucher, what is the revocation status of that voucher? Is it currently valid, invalid, is it currently revoked or not revoked? And so there's again these two different types. This is actually kind of interesting, different than X509, right? They started off with CRLs, discovered some issues, scalability issues with the CRLs. They moved into OCSP. This actually kind of combines both approaches into a single artifact and allows for deployments to choose which approach they want to support. Again, there's the created on and expires on fields. And then there's the revocation type. So we just spoke that there's two different types, and so for each type there's specific subfields. In the next slide we'll go into the details of each of those subtrees. And then lastly there's the additional data for catch-all, any data. Okay, so those two subtrees, if it's an issuer-wide voucher revocation, which again is like a CRL, then inside that, again, it may be a whitelist or a blacklist. I think this is actually open to some discussion. CRLs themselves are blacklists only. There's no real notion of a whitelist, but it seemed like we could support both. I don't know if this is, maybe it's just at feature creep of sorts. So I'm kind of open on this point. But let's just concentrating on the blacklist. You can see that then it would be a list of voucher identifiers. Each voucher identifier is the fingerprint, the SHA-256 fingerprint of the voucher itself. So the voucher is an artifact. It's like a file. You can do a SHA-256 fingerprint, and that is in fact the voucher identifier string. The other one, the voucher specific, is again, this is sort of like a OCSP response. And it starts off with the voucher identifier. So for which voucher does it, it relate to? And then for that voucher, its current status and that enumerated value. I wish I had put down the values, but there are values like revoked or not revoked. And then if it's revoked, then there's subfields for when was it revoked and why was it revoked. And the reasons why it was revoked was actually taken directly from the OCSP response draft, right? So for all the different reasons, and there's actually 12 or so different reasons for why it may be revoked, such as private key has been compromised, or an intermediate certificate was expired, or the certificate authority went out of business, these kinds of reasons. So that's the nature of these subtrees. Okay, so encoding strategy. If you recall, in the zero-touch draft, one of the open issues was how to support signing the data sorry, it wasn't that. It was how do you take a Yang tree, which is intended to be Netconf or RESTconf configuration data, and actually convert it into an artifact, something like a file. And so the current draft says that we want to encode the artifact as if it were the same as the response from a RESTconf server, right? So like if you were to load the RESTconf server with the Yang data model and do a GET request on that particular subnode, and you know what that response would look like, right? Which is just the open tag and the close tag just for that particular thing. Effectively, that's what we're saying. We're to take that response and put it into a file or a document format. And so I mean, it technically works, but from a standards perspective, it's kind of loose, and it's unclear if we should try to do something better in defining it. So some options: we could just leave it as is, as the draft currently says, which I'm happy or okay with. Right, it allows us to move forward immediately, or we could define a Yang to artifact encoding, try to actually enable some standard-based support for how you can convert a Yang data tree into an artifact. And then lastly, we could just not use Yang, right? Just ditch Yang altogether and use some other modeling language to get around this. So I'll stop here just for a second to see if anyone has any comments about how we should address this encoding issue. I was kind of looking at Jürgen. I'm looking at Jürgen to see if he's going to come to the mic, but okay, I guess we'll take this one to the list. Okay, also there's a signing strategy. both artifacts must be signed, but the current draft, the whole signing strategy has not been selected yet. We have some options that have been discussed. The first is, sorry, there's a question to Mike.
Rick Taylor, as soon as you brought up this slide, then the answer to the question at the bottom of the previous slide becomes very, very relevant.
Okay.
Because of course, if you're signing it, then you need to have some sort of canonical format that's being supported everywhere. Seaboy Yang, just as a question, it's fairly dense, it's binary, I don't know whether it's got very far.
So once it's been put into a file format or an artifact, a message, right? Regardless if it's encoding, how many white spaces or not, it is what it is, and it can be signed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry. Yeah.
So some options for how to do signing. The first, similar to what we're currently doing, the zero-touch draft, is to use PKCS7. It supports this notion of not embedded signatures. But as I also mentioned in the zero-touch draft, the PKCS7 is no longer, it's kind of out of favor. You should move to CMS. So that's obviously the second option. The last option is to use Java Web Security, which despite I think actually JSON Web Security, but despite its name, it's not exclusive to JSON. You can actually sign any format, including XML or even binary if you want. So, and that last format, JWS, is favored by the Anima design team. So something to think about. I'm not sure if this is a point to discuss right now, but I just want to bring it to your attention that this draft is incomplete. We have not yet selected a signing solution. And that's the front and center. As far as
if you have any opinion on the issues raised here, please comment on the mail list. Your preference or any other comment, please bring it to the mail list.
Well,
I mean, we can for sure discuss it here, but if I don't hear anything, people should still comment.
Well, yeah, but maybe we should decide if we want to adopt it first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
All right. But just to let you know, this is one of the issues that we're looking at right now. All right. Next steps. So this draft is already close to completion. It's very close. I mean, in discussion with my co-authors, which are mostly from the Anima design bootstrapping design team, we believe that this is a few weeks out, maybe 6 weeks plus or minus, until we'd be ready for something like a last call. Just to give you a sense of how close we think we are. So we just need to resolve this artifact encoding issue and finalize the signing strategy and clean up any loose ends, such as that whole whitelist, blacklist thing. What do we want to do there? And things like that. But the really big question is, which working group should adopt this draft, right? The zero-touch draft has a normative reference to this draft, right? So regardless of which working group it goes to, there's a normative reference that we have. But it is expected that drafts in other working groups will also have normative references to this draft as well.
If you say working groups, I know Anima, which
And
other working group is
six-ish.
Six-ish?
Yes.
Okay. So did you ask the
Say,
question already?
The authors, what is the author's preference?
So this is my home working group. My preference is to stay here, but I'm also willing to.
As an individual, I see it as, beneficial if we keep zero touch and the voucher draft together in the same working group.
And also, let me just clarify. This definitely needs to be adopted by a working group. There's no choice about that. It's only a question of which working group.
Dan Bogdanovic. Well, the only thing is that for the use cases, the other working groups might have, better, that they will have a better insights for the use cases for the vouchers. And then based on that, they would have, I believe, at least expertise what has to be done. And then if there is some requirements on the protocol change, they could come back to this working group where we could answer those questions.
I don't believe there would be any. Well, you said protocol change, but it's really in the zero touch. It was an artifact before, and it's like, remember, it was a vendor specific binary form, it's an opaque, so it really doesn't matter what. It's not going to impact the zero touch draft one way or the other. That's what I'm trying to say.
As far as I can see, there are, no detailed use case in your draft. So does Anima have any other use case document which explains voucher usage?
Yes and no.
Okay.
And if my draft doesn't have the use, actually, I think it does. There's a whole, there's a section in the zero touch draft that refers to vouchers, and another section and they are artifacts, and so each of those artifacts are in a way defined inside the zero touch draft, as to what they are and.
But I see your draft mainly as a solution.
Yes. Their draft is also a solution of, it's a bootstrapping protocol, and they have a need for assigning ownership using the voucher, and then
So
also.
let me ask then a clear question. Who is interested to work on this topic in Netconf working group? Show hands, please. 3, 4, with yourself. 5.
5. Okay.
Who is against?
I'm interested in in this draft. I have use cases for this draft myself. The only thing is, I don't know if other people have the use cases as well. So if I know we touched it occasionally, but from what I heard, the use cases from other working groups that they have used for this draft. That's all I'm saying.
So I just would like to hear Benoit's opinion, as he is also responsible for Anima, I think.
No,
he's not.
I was responsible for Anima. This is Benoit speaking. I'm not any longer. I would be interested to understand from the security ADs if there are any other use cases, or if anything has been done in that area before taking a decision, right?
Okay.
So if you could drop an email to the security ADs and see what.
So what would be the exact question to them?
Any work or use cases in that voucher draft? I don't know what I don't know in the security area.
So,
there is some security aspect to it, and that's a simple verification.
Okay, so what would be, from your point of view, Benoit, the process to decide on working group adoption, whether this is Netconf or Anima? Do we need to come together with Anima chairs and Six's chairs and related ADs? I don't know. This will be a big group to discuss. And
I don't know, but people want to work on this. I see you mentioned 3, 4, 5 here.
5
right?
Can't count it.
Okay, so
I mean, is it okay if we adopt it here and Anima working group object to our decision? I don't know.
I spoke with
there is no clear process for such adoption.
I spoke with Sheng, the co-chair of Anima, just this morning, and told him that I would be asking this working group about the adoption.
Okay.
And if it was very positive, then but if not very positive, then tomorrow's session he would be asking the Anima working group if they would be interested in adopting. But it's going to be hard for them to do that.
Adopting is one thing. Getting the right people to work on this, and then more than 3, 4, or 5, it's even better, right? So maybe what we need to do is have a quick chat with Terry, who's the AD of Anima, with the 3 of us. Terry.
Who is the AD for 6? Suresh, or?
To be checked. I think Suresh.
Okay.
And double check with the security ADs. So maybe we want to send an email together just after this meeting.
Okay.
And try to make some progress while we have everybody here this week. And you will get hopefully an answer by tomorrow morning for Anima.
So, we don't actually have to solve this right now. I mean, from the author's perspective, we can go ahead and continue making progress. And in parallel, we could, ADs and chairs can try to figure out which working group makes the most sense.
Anyway, we should do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So then that's it. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Last presentation. So before Rob comes on and starts to talk about the data store design team update, how many people here have not heard any part of the discussion in the NetMod mailing list? Is there anyone here who has not heard this discussion before? Because then Rob can quickly delve into the details for as it applies to Netconf and RESTconf.
Before we start with this, just a few words on the status I see. As I was commenting in NetMod session, I mean, the data store concept, the current published data store concept is in a Netconf RFC. So as NetMod and Netconf are sister working groups, there is actually no issue if this topic has been adopted in NetMod and a design team has been established, and we have a result right now which is valuable, and we would like to go to consensus achievement together with the two working groups. As far as I understand, it is our aim to achieve consensus in both working groups. I think this is no big deal because 95% of people who are interested in this topic are active in both working groups. So this was our tradition actually. So once Rob has presented, I will again ask for comments, and I mean, I will urge people to comment if they have a comment, and even if it's not today, they should come up on the mail list and comment. So as a matter of fact, we are going to support the design team result. And this is the way we are going to act. And if there is a comment, we would like to hear it as early as possible. So please, go ahead.
So, so my agenda is effectively to do a very quick recap. I'll try and keep it very brief since everyone already knows that, on what the design team came up with in terms of data stores. And then I want to really focus on the protocol implications in Netconf, both for Netconf itself and also RESTconf. And of the two, I think that RESTconf is probably more interesting actually. So that's one we should try and spend most time on. So to do the quick recap, we are introducing 3 new data stores: the intended, the applied, and the operational state. All 3 of these data stores are read-only. And we've got a picture just to remind people of what those look like in these discussions that carry on. So our running is feeding into an intended data store. That's effectively showing the view of the running with inactive nodes removed, expansion of templates, that sort of thing. And effectively, it's subject to validation. In fact, we're saying that almost validation is now moving to the end of intended rather than being running, in terms of a clarification of that point. And it can be thought about as the thing that's about to feed into being applied. So it's the configuration that's come from via running that you're about to put into the system. One other clarification here in this diagram is that intended is really kept in lockstep with running. So if you were to read data out of both of them at the same time, they must give a consistent view. They're giving the same interpretation of the data. Down at the bottom, we've got the applied data store. So this is where we feed in the information from running along with its sort of dynamic protocols on I2RS. They come together, and then that feeds into operational state. It's worth pointing out that the applied data store is really just a view or a subset of that operational state data store. In fact, it represents the config true nodes of the operational state data store that have the property of being dynamic or static. Lada.
Those dynamic configuration protocols are mentioned twice next to applied and operational state. I assume this is a mistake, probably.
No. So the idea here is effectively that these protocols could feed in logically into either of these two places. I think this diagram might be confusing. The only thing that actually differs with them is what the origin is. So if the origin is marked as dynamic or a sub-identity of dynamic, then logically it's going to be feeding into applied. If the identity is system or, well, it would be system, then logically it's feeding into the operational state part and wouldn't appear in applied. So that's...
All right, so does it mean that things like routing protocols are included in this category now?
Well, it hasn't been defined, so I don't know.
Because they should also be present then somewhere, because these are quite important probably.
So is that normal routing protocols in terms of sort of config false nodes, or do you mean ones that have been added as config true? Because this metadata stuff is only applying to the config true nodes.
Well, I assume it's talking about RIB.
So RIB is mostly going to be config false.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of how this diagram's also been drawn in other ways, is the applied data store box as effectively being a subset inside that operational state. You just the two different representations of the same thing. And in that case, you'd only have one set of arrows coming in. Yes, Jason.
Jason Stern. I like that you added the origin onto the right there. That's pretty useful.
Yeah.
We may want to clarify that doesn't just apply to control plane data stores, because it gives the impression that it only applies to the bullet above it.
Yep.
And the other thing is the CT should be on the last should be config true and config false.
That's
right?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll blame Kent for that one. And in the same way that running and intended are kept in lockstep because they're representing views of the same data in a way, the same also applies between the applied and operational state. Because the applied data store is just returning a subset of the operational state, if you were to do a GET request on both of them at the same time, you would have to get consistent data out of the two of them. There's no way that they can ever be different. So the other interesting aspect that's coming out of the design is this origin attribute that appears for the config true nodes in the applied and also the operational state data stores. And we're defining 4 different values for that: static and dynamic. Static's the data that comes from running or from intended, it says here. Dynamic's the data that comes from those dynamic protocols such as I2RS. Data model is defined for sort of default values that are defined in the data model. And finally, system is any other data that's coming from some other source by the system. So we've got these four identities, and the use of identities allows for some extension. So you could do sub-identities based on those, for example, DHCP based on dynamic. In the case of I2RS, you could define a small set of static identities that derive from dynamic or dynamic I2RS, but you wouldn't be able to obviously have a sort of random name there or an arbitrary name there. That wouldn't work. So that's my quick summary of the data store stuff. We've had solid support for the call for consensus adoption. So this might be the appropriate time to check whether we got support for confirming that here. Is that the right time?
Right. All right. So you want to go ahead. So I guess a show of hands to show the support for adopting the proposed solution into the Netconf working group. Sorry. No, sorry.
Lou Berger, I'm
Yeah.
confused. We already adopted this in NetMod.
No. Okay.
So it's
yeah,
just
Netconf working also supports.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. So
so we show already a lot of hands.
Okay. Brilliant.
So this is also I mean, we know with this that people are interested and people understand somehow the design team document.
Okay. Okay. So any questions on this point on the data store part of it now before I move on? No. So the stuff that's more interesting, I think, in here is the sort of protocol implications, and that's what we're seeking sort of working group input here. In terms of how this has been structured, it's really, we're throwing out for ideas. In terms of the design team, we've not actually spent that much time discussing the sort of protocol implications. We spent most of the time trying to get the data stores right, the definitions of those data stores and how they interact. We know that there's sort of work needs to be done on the protocols, but that also needs to be done in this working group, I think, is the expectation. So the following slides are sort of to start that conversation. They actually represent what Kent and I think. Some of this has come out of that document, that draft, that ideas out of that, plus some bits that we've sort of changed slightly. So it doesn't necessarily represent any sort of consensus. It's just points for discussion. So Netconf implications, effectively, we need to have mechanisms required to advertise support for the 3 new data stores that are being defined here: attended, applied, and operational state. All three of these will be optional to implement, but for this solution to be sensible and useful, then it requires at least, if you're going to implement any of this, you have to implement the operational state data store. You could choose not to implement the others, and that doesn't actually stop things working. But if you were to choose not to implement operational state, then that would restrict you from using models that combined config and state trees together in future. So that's sort of the key bit. Our expectation is that getConfig could be used for both the new intended and applied data stores. There's a question as to whether it should also be applicable to the operational state data store. I think that our feeling is it probably should. I don't know if anyone has any different opinions on that or any thoughts. Everyone just wants to finish. Kent.
All right, so you just mentioned that the operational state data store was the one that would have to be implemented for it to be sensible.
Yeah.
So if the other two were not implemented, then would we have to have getConfig for operational state data store?
You could, well, not necessarily. You could just support getConfig on running.
So and only use a different operation on operational state data store.
Yes.
Okay.
Possibly. Yeah. So as Kent's sort of alluding to, the suggestion is that we define a new getData operation, and the aim here is that getData is a new operation to return the contents of any data store, and it's obviously its name is not tied to config or state. It's just going to say return the data of a given data store, all of it by definition. So for config data stores, it's effectively the equivalent of doing a getConfig request on those data stores. Will be returning the same thing because that request returns all the data for those data stores. The key difference here is that the getConfig one probably wouldn't include any of the origin metadata, where the expectation is that this getData would probably support an optional parameter that allows you to return the origin metadata. So that would be the difference between the two. In terms of how you return the origin metadata, the expectation is to have this optional parameter, and by default you probably wouldn't include it, but then you've got an option to return it if you need. And what about getConfig? Would we have the option of returning the origin metadata on the getConfig request? If we did allow it to be on that, then obviously not all of these config data stores actually have this origin metadata. So running a candidate and startup wouldn't have that. So that's one thing to consider there. If you've got thoughts and opinions, now's the time to step up and express them.
Ashish from Sienna. What's the difference between getData and normal get?
So normal get request is defined as giving you running plus config false nodes. So I don't think it allows you to express the data store. Isn't it already predefined? So whereas this request getData will take as an argument which data store to return. We want to get rid of get requests. Okay. So that's on my next slide actually. If that's okay. So get.
Excuse me. Martin had a comment here. Leave getConfig as it is. Add getData with new options for returning metadata.
Okay. So get is the more contentious one, and the question is, can we deprecate get? Effectively, it's sort of obsoleted by having this operational state data store, because that operational state data store view is sort of equivalent to what get was giving you today, but the correct information. In the new world of this operational state data store, if this draft goes forward and makes progress, then the get request doesn't really make much sense. Because once you've got an operational state data store, it doesn't really make sense to take your running config and then half of your operational state and sort of jimmy them together. It's not a sort of sensible view of the system, and hence supporting that would be potentially quite expensive for systems that have now moved to an operational state data store. You'd have specific code to have to try and do that, and it's not a useful view. So the hope would be that we could potentially deprecate support for get, and one option is whether you could sort of map a get request as to a get data request on the operational state data store. I mean, is that is that a workable, pragmatic solution? Where that wouldn't have any issues, I think, is for the data models we have today. You could define that logically, if all the configuration is automatically applied, which is sort of what's implied today, that you've got this sort of looseness of definition of what's going on, that it effectively running ends up being the same, so the operational state data store ends up being the same as running plus config false. The point where those data stores diverge and that no longer becomes true is when we merge config and state trees together. So if our models change to merge config and state together, then you lose the ability to have interfaces that have not been configured, as a classic example. So whereas that's solved by having a separate state tree, of config false state tree, if you merge those together, you lose that ability until you have the operational state data store, because that's allowed to have these system created interfaces, and hence that solves the problem in a different way. Yep. What's my last point? Do servers that support operational states still need to support get at all? I mean, the other choice is just, do you just not support this option? You just say, actually, if you're implementing this, can we realistically say, no, we don't support get? So that's the other option. I personally would prefer to at least support get mapped onto get data of the operational state data store, but I'm not sure everyone will support that view. Any comments? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't read the draft yet. Yeah, I'll tell you. Parviz Yagani. So if you look at a real deployment scenario, so the data store, you have to ensure eventual consistency if you have multiple replica of the data store.
Yep.
I haven't read the draft. Is that already reflected in draft?
I think so, yes, effectively. You put your configuration into the running data store. The way I think of it is the data coming from the operator. Primarily, what goes into running is what the operator would like the system to be doing. You do your template expansion, you take out your inactive, and that generates your intended. And then at some point in the future, the applied configuration and the operational state data store gets updated to reflect what the system is actually doing. So there's some time delta delay there. And the idea here is that the operational state data store should always accurately reflect what the system is doing. So if you were to pull a line card out, for example, then you'd remove those interfaces from the operational state data store. That config would go away from the operational state data store, but it would still be present in the running data store. So the fact that the user had configured it and had that intent is still there, but the fact that the system is now no longer reflecting that is also reported.
But there are two aspects. One aspect has to do with the device configuration.
Okay.
And versus the service configuration.
Yep.
And then you have the concept of sharding, yeah?
Sorry, the concept of?
Sharding.
Okay, yeah.
Do you have that captured here?
No, I mean, I don't think that's captured in Netconf today. I don't think there's any sort of consistency between multiple devices. And I don't think personally, I don't think you want to introduce locking. I think the idea here is to move more towards an asynchronous system that is eventually consistent, is my view. So you push the config in, you monitor the system, and the way I think of this is you would have a subscription request on the operational state data store that feeds back up to your management systems, and then they can compare the configuration that they desire the system to be in versus what it's actually doing.
Last one. Does the latency become really an issue? The way that you really go and access the data, or you update the data, is that considered in your draft?
I don't know why the latency is an issue. I think that the latency here should be less of a problem, because you can get the option of, if you do asynchronously, you have the option of updating the leaves individually. So as an operator that's monitoring the system, they would get notifications more quickly about how some bits of the config have been applied. Rather than today, you have to wait for that Netconf request potentially to complete and return to find out whether or not the configuration has actually been applied.
My reading of the draft says that eventual consistency is the whole kind of purpose of the flow, but there's no timing that says how long it should take between the various data stores. So the implementation, at least my reading of it, has to be able to cope with the time it will take for eventual consistency and the system is, and the definition of the data store is orthogonal to how long it would take.
I give you a real example, real life example. Look at like Open Daylight, yeah? Implementation of the data store. They are grappling with the idea that their current data store doesn't scale because of many reasons. So they're moving into a new data store design like etcd version 3 or something like that.
Okay. Rick Taylor, a clarifying question first to do with the get and get data topic.
Yeah.
So if operational state is supported, then that's advertised in some sort in the capabilities handshake.
Yes.
So I think the postole principle applies here, because a client may not understand that you support, or a client may not have been specifically written to handle operation state and just do basic gets at you. In which case it's expecting running plus config false, but you don't really support that anymore, but it doesn't really know that you've just handed it operational state and will behave as it always thought you would. But if the client does understand, oh, hey, he does operational state and so do I, that's cool, then get can be assumed to be a get data of this. So you could pretty much say it's an alias.
Yes.
And legacy clients won't notice the difference. And they probably won't.
They won't notice the difference until the models change. But then once the models change, I think if the models converge, you have to effectively adopt this, I think. That's sort of requirement.
Yeah.
They're tied hand in hand. If this gets adoption, you can modify the models to make on the assumptions that this makes. But if it doesn't or doesn't go forward, then you can't. Or you have the choice of doing it.
Okay, so personally, third, I would go for the aliasing I think is best.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there are multiple people here who are not wearing their badges. You're bad people. Okay, so now I'm Channel and Jürgen Schönwalder. Get has a certain definition. You can't change it to mean get data.
Okay.
Then Martin said, I agree with Jürgen. It would break clients. If we deprecate get, servers will decide if they still implement it or not. Some will support it.
Okay.
Okay, Andy Bierman, I agree with those comments. You absolutely cannot change get. This group is extremely router centric. Imagine there are servers that don't take a long time to converge, that don't have a lot of data. What if I implemented just the example jukebox? I need all this cruft? No, I don't. Okay, so then get still continues to work just fine. Okay, so I don't even think it should be deprecated. I think new stuff should be added, and you put it in the description clause the issues with get, and say why you'd want to use get data instead.
So one comment, Andy, on this is it's not just the latency that this solution effectively solves. I mean, it also helps solve the issue of I2S data coming in, and it solves things like interfaces coming away, and systematic data. So it's not just purely solving latency.
No, all get does is combine config true and config false. Has no concept of intended versus applied. Never did.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. I'm saying that this solution is not just solving latency. That's not its intended purpose. It's solving other things as well.
Okay.
Oh, I seem to have no slides.
Sorry, Martin said one more thing to Andy. Get works fine with foo and foo state. But not with single tree data models.
So to clarify that, well, that's just saying that get works with existing data models, but as soon as you combine the two together, then get won't work because you can't return data for things that are not in your intended configuration, but are in your operational state. So that's the point where it diverges and becomes a problem. So an interface that's not configured but exists on the system, loopback 0 or something. So there's an open question. What about other Netconf operations? We've not thought about very much. We don't think any of these need to be supported since the new data stores are all read-only. Again, this might require further thought and looking into. Validate was one that we were questioning, perhaps whether you wanted to do validate on some of these other data stores. I don't know. Right. So, any other questions on RESTconf, on Netconf? Otherwise, I'll move on to RESTconf, which is going to have similar sort of answers and comments. So the RESTconf implementation, there was a question that Phil raised earlier in his presentation, which is effectively what is the scope of RESTconf? What was it trying to achieve? Is it meant to be matching everything that Netconf does, but in a RESTful way? Or is it meant to be an easier subset of that? So understanding what the scope of RESTconf is might affect what the scope of the answers to the other questions are.
Just a clarification question. If you go back to your previous slide.
This one?
Thank you. You just meant applied the 3 databases you mentioned, not the control plane data stores, right? Because
yeah, I don't think so.
That's
Actually, Kent might be able to best answer this one because this was one of your suggestions. Do we need validate? What was your thought for validate?
Okay, so first off, just like it says, the new data stores are all read-only, so concepts like lock and unlock and edit config doesn't make sense, right? But validate, there is a question. I mean, there's these must and when expressions, min elements for a list. So we'd like to think it should, right? We can't enforce it because, of course, the system will do whatever the system's going to do, and the operational state needs to be reported exactly as it is. But one would hope that the system, it should adhere to those principles of, the minimum elements and must and whens, you think. And if that's true, then it sort of makes sense that there might be an operation validate on those other data stores so that one could discover at least whether or not that it's coming through the way you'd hope it to be, right? That's the thinking for maybe supporting validate on these other data stores.
the clarification was that intended, applied, and operational state is what you meant by the data stores and not the control plane data stores, because those we hope we can use RPCs and regular set.
I think
I thought
so,
that's
yes.
what you, all your document points that way.
Yeah.
And the validate can, that's a really interesting question.
Okay.
If you have more detailed comments from I2RS point of view, would you be able to provide them to NetMod and Netconf
Yes, we will.
playlists?
I just,
we would like to have a complete list of issues or comments you have.
yes, we'll need a little I2RS list discussion, and I need to find the right people. This is, of course, new news.
Yeah,
and
sure.
But I think I also want to see what happens when we go a couple weeks with the implementations. Joe sent me some comments. I want to just play with, try a little bit and then implement a little bit before we go on.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether we actually want to discuss this right now. It sounds like we've got about 5-10 minutes left, so it might be worth going on to
now
more.
8 left.
8 on the.
Actually, let's say 6 left.
Okay, so I'll cover the more specifics. So the RESTconf data resource, effectively, again, that's very similar to the gets. It's representing a combined config and state. Yeah.
So Martin said, RESTconf obviously doesn't have all the Netconf features. Okay, so never mind.
So the data resource represents combined config and state together, and it's sort of equivalent to bundling running together with operationals, running with config false, I think. Yeah, go on.
Andy Bierman, RESTconf needs to remain simple. You can access Netconf operations through the operation resource. Implementations do that today. You can dive into as much Netconf complexity as you want using the operation resource and just access the Netconf operations that way.
Yeah, but there might be an option of keeping a simplified view in RESTconf, but still allowing the data source to be exposed in that. Is that a problem?
strongly opposed to changing RESTconf. You can add stuff to it, such as additional query parameters, but you're not changing anything.
Or different paths, additional paths?
You want to add a query parameter that says, I just want my applied config or something like that, then that's something else. You could do that. And then somebody who supports that query parameter would answer that. But I keep saying this is not a problem in all implementations. There's absolutely no support from my customers for this.
Okay.
Kent Watson. So one of the implications of the upstate design team adopting this approach is a fundamental change in how we do our data models in the future. Specifically, the desire or the need for having the top level dash state subtrees disappears. It's the hope that future data models will no longer have separated dash state, top level dash state trees, because the system generated values would all be intermingled and reportable that way.
Yeah.
So if that's true, then a RESTconf client that is not able to support reading from the operational state data store would no longer be able to get any operational state for system generated entities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, the draft does not make any distinction between intended and applied. It only makes a distinction between config true and config false. That's what it does. It doesn't have the ability to I don't even think it's a great idea to use the same path to the exact object to mean totally different things. I think that's a pretty bad idea. So I don't even think there's a problem with foo state and foo. I think it's perfectly fine to do that if you want to.
Okay. So the questions that on RESTconf are very similar to Netconf effectively. Should the design of the RESTconf data resource be supported? Should it be deprecated? And the same, I think it's effectively the same question, but a different protocol. In terms of how you might, if you were allowed to expose data stores in RESTconf, there's a couple of options on how you could do that. You could use a query parameter to choose which data store to do that, which data store to return, or you could let the data store all be expressed in the path. This doesn't stop you from expressing a combined tree as well in some way. This would be an additional option, effectively allow a client to access those data stores explicitly if they wanted to. If you were to do that again on the same sort of comments I made earlier about how you map a get request onto get data, again, you could have the same suggestion here that the operations could map through like put and post implicitly update the running or candidate configuration, get request implicitly read from the operational state configuration. I imagine that has the same objections as earlier from various people because it's the same semantic solution. Fetching origin metadata, there's a question here, should the origin metadata be available in RESTconf at all? Is that, if RESTconf is meant to be basic and easier, things maybe don't need it. But if you did need it, then the assumption is that you would add a parameter to the request to be able to return that data. And the assumption is that the default is you wouldn't return it. So that effectively covers everything I've got on RESTconf.
So we need to stop here, I assume. So you are asking the last question, then I have to speak.
I can take it offline. It's just the last slide. There's a problem for
okay.
the metadata. We'll talk about it later.
We heard in the room that there is support for the design team document and the proposal in this document. We for sure need to validate this support on the mail list. Just a question to NetMod co-chairs. Are you guys going to ask for consensus on NetMod mail list? Or my preference would be if this consensus call goes to both mail lists, to NetMod and Netconf, to get it at the same time.
Hi, Lou Berger. What do you mean by consensus? Do you mean to adopt the draft as a foundation for the work? Or do you mean that we're done? Or are you saying both?
I mean, actually both.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I think it is.
I mean, adopting the draft, I don't think it is a real adoption. It is actually agreeing on the proposal in this draft to work on subsequent drafts to address the issue described there.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that we were in agreement that we're not saying that this is the final answer. It's the beginning of.
No, there are many open questions we need to
Good,
clarify,
good.
and there needs to be a Netconf bis draft and possibly a RESTconf bis draft coming up with solutions.
Perfect, because to me, when we say declare consensus, it's sort of the end of the process, not the beginning.
Yeah,
So-
this is a final, I mean, the consensus call is nothing else than a final agreement that this is the way to go. Any open issue needs to be addressed on the way to go there.
To me, it seems, I think we're completely on the same page. To me, it seems perfectly reasonable to issue the adoption call in NetMod, and at the same time ask Netconf to provide input into adoption, run the process in one of the working groups. We got to run it in one group, so run it in NetMod, and at the end, do a joint last call on the document. So at the end, when we do have, when it's time to declare consensus.
What exactly do you mean with input for adoption? I don't understand. I mean, the Netconf working group needs to come also to a conclusion whether the working group supports it or not.
Correct.
So if NetMod's working group is being asked for adoption,
Yes.
I mean, or for consensus on this draft,
Yes.
we can do it at the same time with the same question, so we get it in parallel and it's done.
I agree that we should do it together, but we have to run the process formally in one place. I don't know how to run the process in both working groups at the same time. You know, so when we
for me, it is obvious that Netconf working group has to ask the same question to Netconf mail list.
when it's adopted, do we have the same document with draft IETF NetMod and draft IETF
It
Netconf?
is, I mean, Netmod is the home, and it is a draft IETF Netmod.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, if we end up with a working group with one working group document and one working group, I'm happy. So I think the answer is yes. Sounds good to me.
I mean, Netmod working group is the home of this draft, and we can ask both working groups at the same time.
Sounds good. I think
Even with the same mail.
Yeah, agreed. Sorry.
Yeah, just to be clear, we're going to do the call for adoption on the NetMod mailing list. We'll CC the Netconf mailing list. That's all you want to know, right?
Yeah.
We'll CC you. But the draft will be adopted in the NetMod mailing list.
Yeah,
Separately,
CCing is actually not, I mean, why don't you write an email as a consensus call on this draft? I mean, the adoption is obvious next step in NetMod.
separately, you need to adopt drafts in Netconf working group for changes in RESTconf and Netconf, right? So you wouldn't ask the NetMod working group if we're going to, need to have consensus on those. So.
Well, as a matter of fact, Netconf has subsequent work to do, and therefore Netconf working group needs to be asked whether the working group agrees on this proposal.
Yep.
So do you ask us to send a separate consensus call to Netconf working group? My preference would be if we would handle this with the same mail at the same time.
And I think we have agreed, right? Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure whether we agreed.
Benoit.
What Lou said
I agree.
as a last statement was kind of a bit different.
I have no issue that we send one message to both lists and ask for input I'm perfectly fine with having it CC'd on both lists at the same time, and that we
And
as
in
the
the
chairs.
same mail, you can actually write clearly that this is going to be adopted if the consensus call is passed. It is going to be adopted as NetMod working group item.
Right. I think I have no problem with that. The only sticking point to me is a consensus call is a formal step at the end, right before you go and publish as part of working group last call. So I think I'm just getting caught up on the word.
Not necessarily a consensus call can be
it's fine. The consensus
made for different things.
I agree. I think from a process standpoint, we're all in good shape. I just want to make sure. I wanted to make sure I understood what you said or what you intended. I believe I do. The next step is a single message that goes out to both groups that says, shall we adopt this draft as draft IETF, NetMod, whatever.
Right. Perfect.
Great. And please discuss on both lists.
Perfect.
Okay, Andy Berman. So, it's confusing me to what exactly the process is here, but there is no draft. There's nothing for Netconf working group to do yet, because nobody's written a draft that says these are the exact things I'm adding to Netconf, or these are the exact things I'm adding to RESTconf. And we don't have any need for a call for adoption until those drafts exist.
But Netconf working group has to agree on the proposal in the design team document before we can proceed. If any Netconf working group member objects to any part of the design team document, we are stuck. I mean, we cannot start the subsequent Netconf BIS drafts if there is a clear objection to any part of the design team document.
Benoit speaking. So the next thing I would like to ask the Netconf chair and NetMod chair is to prepare charter updates, because basically what we're doing here is an engagement to do work, right? So we'll have to update both charters.
Even the charter update wouldn't be possible if there is an objection to the design team document.
I get that. I'm trying to plan the next step.
Right? Yeah. So charter update is necessary indeed, because we need to update the Netconf and possibly also on the RESTconf documents.
Since we're all together, or mostly together, do we have time to ask a moment if anyone has an objection that they would like to raise now?
I wouldn't like to do this because the session ended 5 minutes ago. We are discussing, but
that's
it is.
That's a fine point. I wasn't paying attention to time either. So
let's ask the question on the mail list, or
well, that's part of that. Be implicit in the call. Just I thought if we had time, I accept that.
Yeah.
Over. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody left the room, so it wouldn't be.
No, you're right. You're right. I didn't realize the time.
Yeah, it's not that easy. I just would like to ask you whether you agree with the main parts of what I was saying.
So
I had to react immediately. Sorry about that. I was working.
So what I heard him say was that yes, he was going to make the consensus call on both the meetings.
Yeah.
So
this is in my opinion necessary. The result is the document is going to be adopted as NetMod working group item. NetMod is actually the home for this document. It's okay.
So I didn't understand where the difference was. I thought both of you were saying.
What?
I thought both of you were agreeing, so I wasn't sure where the disagreement was.
Lou mentioned that he is going to send a mail to NetMod and put Netconf on CC. This is not okay.